Hello and welcome to my presentation on the fall of classical empires. So let's start out with the Han Dynasty. It was caused by Confucian intellectual activity decreasing. They were no longer thinking of better ways to improve their government and their way of life, which caused problems throughout society. The government lost its power and bureaucrats became more corrupt. People weren't listening to the government and the government couldn't do anything about it. And bureaucrats were no longer thinking about the good of the empire, we're just thinking about getting money and making their lives better as opposed to making others' lives better. And then finally, we have the peasants who would be placed under high taxes that tied them to the land. So they basically forced them to stick to the land and work it so then they could pay their taxes and get by. This general dysfunction caused the dynasty to collapse. Next empire we're going to cover is the Guptas. The ability of the Gupta emperors to control local princes was declining. The government couldn't control the other members within the government that didn't have as much power, so it caused an unbalance and dysfunction. Lots of dysfunction in this PowerPoint. Invasions from the nomadic people weakened the empire, so they didn't have as much strength anymore to hold them off. And then finally, the nomadic people were able to get in, and they destroyed the empire, basically. Finally, we have the fall of the Roman Empire, which there's a lot of things that caused it, but some of the main points were difficulties recruiting effective army. They couldn't. Roman Empire is pretty big, so getting a powerful army was important, because if you didn't have a powerful army, you couldn't hold off invaders, and your empire would slowly get smaller and smaller and smaller. Politicians were corrupt and cruel, especially emperors, because they would constantly be trying to get money and they weren't really focusing on the empire, just focusing on having all their money and what all they wanted. Basic materialism. And tax collection became difficult when the Roman Empire fell in hard times. It was a bad economy because of all the things that have been going on at the time, and they were still the tax collectors were going around collecting taxes, but the people didn't have any taxes to pay to the government, so the government didn't have any money, which caused a lot of bad things to happen. And finally, we have Germanic invaders, which was the ultimate downfall, invaded and destroyed the capital of Rome in 476 CE. Now, that was like the official final blow to the Roman Empire, and that's what ultimately caused its collapse. So how are they all similar? A factor in each one of these collapses involved invasion from nomadic tribes outside the empire. And in Rome, it was the Germanic people, and in the Gupta dynasty, it was the nomadic people from just outside of India, and they all were a major factor in destroying the empire. Bad economy. An economy is everything in a society. If you have a bad economy, your society can't run. And corruption of politicians. Materialism. They were thinking about themselves as opposed to thinking about the good of the empire, which didn't work out in the long run. So how are each one of these collapses different? Rome was unique because they were the only ones who needed an army and couldn't organize one. The Guptas and the Han, they could have benefited from an army, but they weren't dependent on it, such as Rome, who absolutely needed it if they were to survive. The collapse of the Gupta Empire was unique because it was the only empire whose emperors couldn't control their princes. We didn't see any other cases throughout the classical empires that had that problem. And then finally, the collapse of the Han was unique because it was caused by a lack of intellectual activity. The Romans and the Guptas, they were still trying to think of ways to better their lives throughout the collapse, whereas the Han weren't really focusing on that type of thing. So that's all. I hope you enjoyed.